Oh boy, I get to talk about some more obscure World War II aircraft. I love talking about planes and associated materials, especially ones you probably never heard of. So let's do it all over again, just like always. The Avro Anson. Avro Anson? The heck is that? That actually looks like a pretty basic plane, and yeah, they were. These were British twin-engine multi-role aircraft built by Avro in very large numbers. They built over 11,000 of these things, and initially entered service in 1936, so a bit before World War II, but they weren't retired until 1968. What you're looking at with the Anson is not a frontline airplane. While they were multi-role, and theoretically could have done a lot of different jobs, in a similar manner to other British twin-engine planes like the Mosquito or the Beaufighter, it was found the Anson wasn't quite as capable or agile as those two, but what they were was very stable and reliable. As a result, instead of putting them in harm's way, it was decided that they would be the RAF's premier training aircraft, particularly for bomber pilots. Since they were multi-engine, they could serve as a substitute for, well, bombers, which were generally multi-engine unless they were dive bombers, and that meant that they supplied much-needed training for many pilots. And in terms of training aircraft, you couldn't do much better than the Ansons at the time. Again, these were very easy planes to fly. Stable, forgiving. These were the kind of planes you'd want a rookie pilot to be in because, well, there was far less of a risk of them dying horribly, since the plane was very easy to work with. They did serve a little bit in terms of frontline service, mostly in things like maritime reconnaissance, and they were involved in the evacuation over in Dunkirk to help deter attacks by German E-boats. But outside of those two instances, generally they were held back, letting the more agile two-engine planes handle the frontline service. But because of their stability and reliability, they saw a life far beyond just the war. They were sought after for civilian uses, for transportation purposes, and even executive aircraft by larger corporations. That's how good they were in terms of just flying. In terms of airplanes that just did the airplane thing and didn't do the fighting thing. The Ansons were it. Like, they were the planiest planes to ever plane at the time. At least for their two-engine category. They were continually manufactured by Avro until 1952, and like I said, weren't officially retired by the RAF until 1968. Pretty much everyone that flew one and used them had nothing but good things to say, with the sole exception of Australia. This is because the Ansons were partially of a wooden construction, and it was found that the glue they used in said construction didn't really jive well with the Australian climate, and their wings had a habit of just kind of falling off, and that was bad. It was corrected, but yeah, that wasn't so good. Outside of that, though, pretty much everywhere else really liked them. And there are numerous examples still held in preservation. Multiple are in Australia and Canada. One's in Ireland, one's in the Netherlands. At least two are in New Zealand. The United Arab Emirates has at least one. The UK has a whole bunch, and somehow we don't have one here in America. Go figure. The Vultee A31 Vengeance. Yes! Yes! Vengeance! I love it! These were single-engine dive bombers, constructed by Vultee, but to meet French requirements, and built with private funds over at Vultee for sale to foreign markets. Technically speaking, it did enter service with the United States Army Air Forces, but for us, we didn't use them operationally for front-line service. That wasn't how we utilized them ourselves. But the Royal Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, and the Royal Indian Air Force did use them in the frontline service, mostly in Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific. The intention behind the Vengeance was to create basically the ultimate dive bomber. Like, this was a plane specifically to be a dive bomber and nothing else. They could dive vertically without any lift from the wing pulling them off target. Their wings had a 0-degree angle of incidence, and that was meant to better align the nose of the aircraft with the target during a dive, but in actual flight it meant that the pilot had to cruise in a nose-up attitude, meaning there was poor forward view. Their wings were also really weird looking. They were a W shape, but that was because of an error in calculating the center of gravity, believe it or not. It was a mistake. Well, the shape itself wasn't a mistake. It was meant to correct the mistake. Basically, moving the wing back slightly to the center section to correct that balance issue was a simpler fix than redesigning the wing root itself. And it gives the impression that they had an inverted gull wing, but they didn't have that. Regardless of that particular fact, in terms of their one job, they excelled at it. Oh, they were great. Pilots that flew them found them fairly enjoyable, all things considered, but admitted that, yeah, these were dive bombers and nothing else. This was the kind of plane that was very optimized for very specific duties, and had no business doing anything beyond that. That resulted in many weaknesses when compared to other options. Other dive bombers, for example, could mix it in a dogfight if they had to. The Vengeance, despite the intimidating name, really couldn't get away with that nearly as easily. As I said, they were utilized and to decent effect. Again, if you put them in a dive bombing role and got them to the targets, you couldn't ask for a better platform for that job. And they wound up being retired by April of 1948. Only one complete Vengeance still survives today, the serial number A2799, on display at the Camden Museum of Aviation at Narrowland, New South Wales, Australia. There's also components that are held of another Vengeance, held at the Historical Aircraft Restoration Society in Australia, which are meant to form the basis of a new build, but as far as I know, that hasn't happened yet. Still, it's definitely a forgotten plane that, well, if you let it do its one job, was pretty dang good. And if you ask it to do anything else, don't do that. It wasn't built for that. It was built for one job, only one, and nothing else. Okay? The Yokosuka D4Y Suisei, or Comet. Allied reporting name, Judy. The Comets were a 2-seat, carrier-based dive bomber. Oh, another dive bomber, okay. And, as the name might imply, these were super-de-duper Japanese, built for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and operated by them from 1942 to 1945. While conceived as a dive bomber, unlike the Vengeance, the Suiseis proved a lot more flexible. They could do reconnaissance, night fighting duties, and they were pressed into special attack roles. That means they were used for kamikazes? Which, I mean, any plane could technically do that. So, not really a flex there, but it's something else they did. By that I mean they slammed into the enemy with the pilots on board, because that was seen as a good idea. But from a design perspective, and especially for the dive bombing role, they were very good. Highly effective at that job, though they weren't able to be produced in sufficient numbers and they weren't without flaw. Much like a lot of Japanese aircraft, it was decided that in order to cut weight, they didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks or armor. And that wasn't a good idea. Later iterations did switch this up to allow for that. They weren't given armor protection for the crew and fuel tanks until they introduced the D4Y4s. But still, at the end of the day, they were well-designed planes. And in the modern day, there are at least two that survive. In 1988, a restored D4Y-1 would be donated to the Yasukuni Shrine Yushukan Museum in Tokyo, where she remains on display. She was rebuilt from a wreck recovered from the Colonia airfield on Yap Island. There's also an engineless D4Y-3 that was recovered from Bobo Airfield, Indonesia in 1991. She was acquired and restored for static display at the Plains of Fame Air Museum in Chino, California. She actually has a working engine in her now, believe it or not. In order to represent the fact that these were radial engines, she was fitted with an American Pratt & Whitney R1830. Technically speaking, that means she can move. The engine is in running condition, but since she wasn't restored to a level that would be appropriate for, like, flying, she could only do taxiing demonstrations, not actually take off. But still, that's actually a lot more than most of these restored planes get, so hey. The Focke-Wulf Ta-152. Oh, that's a long girl. What the heck is going on? Focke-Wulf? You mean like the 190? And yes it is. Well, no, it's the 152, but it was developed from the 190. These were meant to be a significant improvement over the 190s, and they're called TAs because by that point in time, it was decided the designer's name should be included in the designation, and these planes were designed by Kurt Tank, hence TA for Tank 152. But they are the daughters of the 190s, and they were meant to be produced in 3 different variations: a high-altitude fighter interceptor, the H model, a ground attacker, the C model, and an aerial reconnaissance version, the E model. Only 69 of the planes were produced because the issue with these isn't that they were bad. Not at all, they were actually very, very good. They were tremendously fast, and good for the job that they were for. The original version, the high-altitude one, was meant to be that. They were looking for a plane that had much better performance at higher altitudes because of the whole Allied bomber thing. The 152s were meant to be the answer to this. They were given pressurized cockpits, and the sleek, elongated look you've probably noticed, which kind of looks like if you took a picture of a Focke-Wulf 190, put it into Photoshop, and then stretched it. That's what that looks like. But the point of it was to be sleeker and faster, and they were. They could reach a maximum speed at 360 miles per hour, but that was at sea level. At high altitude, where they were supposed to be, they could reach 472 miles per hour. Oh, okay, that's a lot different. But at the end of the day, they didn't really do anything for Germany in the war. Well, why not? Well, simply put, they first flew in 1944. They were just way too late to the party. By the time they were ready to go, it was already over. No amount of agile planes was going to change that when the Allies had the numbers. Yeah, the 152s were pretty great, but when there's only one of them and like 80 Mustangs, listen, it doesn't matter, you know? As a result, only 69 of the 152s were ever built, and to date, only one manages to survive, which is a miracle in and of itself, given how few in number they were. This was an HO variant, and she's housed at the National Air and Space Museum Paul E. Garber Preservation, Restoration, and Storage Facility in Suitland, Maryland. She's on the list for being restored, but to date that hasn't happened yet. And she's believed to be a pre-production HO model. Serial number 150020. Probably built in 1944, though again they aren't sure. But at least one of this very rare and very unique aircraft still survives, because, otherwise this would be really forgotten. Speaking of forgotten, Fokker D.XXI, which I think is what you say, 21, because those are Roman numerals, right? XXI, 21, yes? Anyone gonna complain? I don't know, ask the Dutch, because this is a fighter from the Netherlands! Yeah! I bet you didn't even know the Netherlands made fighters during the war, and, well, technically they didn't because this was made slightly before the war, but Either way, they did serve during it, so they count. They were designed in 1935 by Dutch aircraft manufacturer Fokker in response to requirements that had been laid out by the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army Air Force. These planes were meant to be inexpensive, rugged, and compact, resulting in an agile little fighter that would serve appropriately for the defense of the Netherlands. And that didn't go well, but not because these turned out bad. The 21s were actually pretty good planes for their time, to be perfectly honest. They were small and agile and decently capable for what they were. However, their problem was sheer numbers. In total, and this includes foreign-built versions, only 148 were ever made. And mind you, the 21s did serve with the Finns and the Danes, so it wasn't just for the Netherlands. So when Germany decided it was a really great decision to just walk into the Netherlands, while the 21s were perfectly capable, there were a lot more 109s. So many 109s. And in that situation, it isn't a matter of technical ability, it was sheer numbers. While pilots did take the 21s up in a valiant defense of the Netherlands, it didn't matter. The Luftwaffe just had too many planes, and there was nothing the Dutch could do. Though for what it's worth, they did much better with the Finns, because the Finns kept them and used them to fight the Soviet Union, while allied with Germany because they were also against the Soviets. It gets complicated. But, in a similar manner to the Brewster Buffalo, the Finns pushed these seemingly underwhelming planes to their absolute limit, and to great effect. At least one of the 21s was able to secure 10 victories all on her own. And that example is, one of the only ones that survives. This was a Finnish-built model, a Mercury engine example, FR-110, on display at the Finnish Air Force Museum, and again has 10 victories to her name, while being piloted by Lieutenant Victor P.XXI during the Winter War. There are a couple of replicas, and technically there's one more original still alive. And by alive, I mean not really alive at all. Number 229 is at the Crash 4045 Museum in Aalsmeer, the Netherlands, but only consisting of the engine, the fuselage tubing, and a partial cockpit. So not really what we're looking for, but it's nice that you're able to save part of her. Outside the Netherlands, these are mostly forgotten aircraft, which is a shame because they were pretty good for what they were, and probably would have done a lot better had they not been faced with just sheer numerical advantage. I mean, there were so many 109s, you guys. You don't understand. The Luftwaffe was not playing in 1940. Wasn't until we threw Spitfires and Mustangs at them that things changed, but before that, ugh. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.